The billionaire Bill Gates turns away from climate catastrophism, saying in a new essay that humanity isn't doomed. And while rising temperatures are a problem, it isn't the biggest problem facing most people. Plus, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton sues the maker of Tylenol over an alleged link to autism promoted by the nation's health secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues on the editorial page, columnist Alicia Finley and editorial board member Mene Ukwe-Barua. As world leaders prepare to jet off to Brazil for the United Nations COP30 climate conference, they're getting a memo from a source that might be hard for them to ignore. That's Bill Gates, who in a new essay calls for a strategic pivot, urging the COP30 crowd to, quote, prioritize the things that have the greatest impact on human welfare, unquote. Here he is this week on CNBC explaining what he hopes world leaders take away from his essay.
Well, if the aid budgets to poor countries were continuing to go up the way they did over the last 25 years, then the trade-offs between climate action and saving children's lives wouldn't be as acute as it is now that these budgets are going down and going down quite a bit. And so the plea here is to say, okay, let's take that very limited money and not have some partitioned off for particular causes. Let's measure it all in terms of the human welfare. How do you help those countries?
Alicia, one thing I think is notable here is that the headline on this memo, this essay by Bill Gates, is 3 tough truths about climate. And here is the tough truth number 1. Climate change is a serious problem, but it will not be the end of civilization. And Alicia, is it just me, but I don't understand how that is a tough truth if he's saying that we are not all doomed by climate change. I mean, it's suggestive, I think, of the crowd that he's talking to, that is, sorry guys, I hate to break it to you, but the world is not going to end.
That's right. I think he's speaking to readers of the New York Times, Bloomberg News, maybe Michael Bloomberg himself, who continues to espouse the view that climate change is a quote unquote existential threat. And the Biden administration has said as much or claimed as much and used this as a reason or justification to heavily subsidize renewables and take all kinds of other actions. And governments in Europe continue to do the same thing. Now, where Bill Gates is headed in his essay is that, well, there are costs, and you imagine that, and there are opportunity costs. That means the more money that you're spending on climate action, whether that be green subsidies or just income redistribution, if you're spending more on electric vehicles or giving people money to put rooftop solar panels on their homes, that means there's less money to spend for other things or less investment in things like cures for malaria treatments, vaccines, and other kinds of things that could actually lift people out of poverty. And in that vast category, I would also include, air conditioning, things that are powered by fossil fuel that over time do actually improve living standards.
To be clear, he isn't backing off on his views about the reality of climate change or even some of his past work. So here he is again on CNBC, asked if the Paris Climate Accord was misaligned.
The one thing about that accord that turned out not to be realistic was the ambitious goal of staying to 1.5 degrees. We won't be able to do that. Even if you took all the money away from health, you wouldn't be able to do that. So now, the question is, okay, what temperature level are we going to end up at? Very important to minimize that, but not at the expense of everything else.
But hey, it's interesting because Gates is now almost sounding like Bjorn Lomborg, the skeptical environmentalist, to quote the titles of one of his books, who, again, it says that climate change is a problem, but says that Americans and the world should be more focused on relieving suffering right now. So some things that Gates talks about is that, yes, there are people who die from extreme heat, but they are dwarfed by deaths from extreme cold. He's talking about how there are millions of people a year that are still dying from poverty-related diseases like malaria. And I also think that it is notable that he takes a shot in this essay at some of the activists who have argued for keeping fossil fuels in the ground. So he says that he says that this pressure has had almost no impact on global emissions, but it's made it harder for low-income countries to get low-interest loans for power plants that would bring reliable electricity to homes, schools, and health clinics. One more quote here from this Bill Gates essay. It says, although climate change will hurt poor people more than anyone else, for the vast majority of them, it will not be the only or even the biggest threat. The biggest problems are poverty and disease, just as they have always been. Monet, I can't be the only one who has heard echoes of some of what Bjorn Lomborg has been saying, including in the pages, the op-ed pages of the Wall Street Journal there.
Yeah, Bill Gates is absolutely right to point out the way that climate change has kind of eclipsed some of these other causes, which the global aid system essentially used to direct most of its resources to, and for which there's much more evidence that they have the ability to actually improve people's lives, especially in the near term. I think that just over the course of our lifetimes, when we were kids, and you thought about some of these international institutions that were raising money and donating to causes overseas in the developing world, you heard a lot more focus back then on fighting disease, especially malaria and other diseases that are widespread and very cheaply treated, on fighting starvation, making sure that people have basic nutrition, and contraception and things of that kind. There was a pretty wide mix of different issues where a lot of wealthy Western countries felt that they could make a difference in the developing world. And over the past 20 years or so, climate change has essentially eclipsed all of those and has hoovered up a lot of the talent, a lot of the well-intentioned young people in the United States who want to go work for a charity, end up working for that cause as opposed to any of the others. Certainly has hoovered up a lot of the donations, and it's very similar to the way that AI has hoovered up all the funding in the private markets over the past 5 years in the United States. It's sort of it's become an all-encompassing area, and there isn't really any investment left to go to some of these other fields. And so I do think that as the politics on climate change have shifted, and as Bill Gates is kind of alluding to without saying explicitly, it's become clear that there isn't going to be the political backing for this campaign that all the NGOs were pushing over the past 2 decades. He feels as if the time is right to finally say, hey, let's reconsider some of these other areas where we can do good.
Alicia, he's also doubling down on the idea that there is innovation that is needed. He says that the goal should be to drive the green premium, the difference between standard technologies and cleaner technologies, drive that green premium to zero. And that's what it will take to, get mass adoption of these technologies, which I think is kind of reflective of the political message that Monet is referring to, that voters in a lot of places over a lot of years now have sent in voting down policies that will drive up their energy costs, for example. It remains to be seen how all of that stuff is going to shake out. So Gates is talking about zero emission steel, clean cement. He even has a line in here about the potential of fusion energy to give us an inexhaustible supply of cheap, clean electricity. I'm for fusion energy if we can make it work. But on the point that you were making about green subsidies, it doesn't suggest a real break with the standpoint of having government and private donors as well, pour money into hopes that there will be the kind of breakthrough that he's talking about.
Right. So wind and solar are on what they call levelized cost basis, pretty competitive with coal, fossil fuels, natural gas. The problem has always been that you have to back them up. That means you have to basically build another plant or battery to provide power when the wind and solar aren't available. So the cost is really 2 to 3 times as much. And so the question is, well, batteries right now are still very expensive. They can't run for really large scale utility batteries, can't run for more than about 4 hours at a time. So in a pinch, yes, they can provide power, but they're not going to be able to provide power all night and be able to get you to that quote unquote net zero utopia that many of the left are hoping for. Another alternative is to use nuclear, these small module nuclear reactors. But there have been a lot of problems scaling these up. Bill Gates has actually invested pretty heavily in some of these startups and some other kind of green embryonic technologies. Not the wind and solar, but others that you mentioned. So it's interesting that he's now supporting more funding, and presumably more government funding for these types of technologies. But again, like the breakthroughs may not happen overnight. We've been working toward better batteries, more dense batteries that can produce power for more time, and there are a lot of different types of technologies that are being experimented with both in the private sector and in government labs, the energy department labs. And you mentioned also fusion, and all that's great. And the government does have a role to play in funding, basic research. But all that said, that's not going to probably drive electricity prices down in the near term. What we really need is to scale up, gas, let's be honest, fossil fuel plants. And some of that's going to require scaling up the manufacturing of gas turbines, in which there is a shortage, and pouring more subsidies into wind and solar. That's actually just discouraged gas turbine manufacturers from doing that. Again, I love technology. I will not bet against a technological breakthrough. But in the near term, what we really do need is more investment in kind of traditional technologies, gas, and maybe more traditional nuclear.
It will be interesting, though, Monet, to see how many climate activists and what portion of that progressive green base follows Gates in this new mold. He's already being denounced by some elements of that faction. And, it's interesting because it seems like it's maybe a turning point. It could be a turning point for this argument that we've been having in the public debate for years now. I mean, it has been framed pretty much as Gates lays it out at the beginning of his essay. We have to do this. We have to do it yesterday. And if we don't, then the world is going to end. And what is so remarkable is that, voters don't seem to buy that. Voters seem to believe in the adaptability of the humanity. They seem to not be willing to make significant sacrifices out of their own pockets for the sake of some kind of promised climate benefit that might be decades down the road. And you've seen that even in very blue jurisdictions in the Pacific Northwest, for example, that have rejected carbon taxes. The price of electricity, now a huge running debate in the New Jersey governor's race that, a Republican candidate, believe it or not, is within striking distance of winning in large part on that issue, on the rising cost of electricity on the day-to-day budgets of families. And so I think what Gates is trying to do here is to take that reality on board, that political reality, and try to figure out a way to turn a pivot. He explicitly says this COP climate conference should be a pivot point and find a way to direct those political energies and activism in a way that is something other than doing the same old thing, which hasn't been successful at the ballot box for years now.
Yeah, I think that the best that Gates can hope for is that there will be essentially a split between the younger activist class for whom climate is an object of faith, and not merely economics or science, and the kind of investor and establishment politician and donor class for whom they have other incentives and are starting to rethink having gone all in on climate change over the course of the past couple of decades. And so that first class, the younger activists, could be represented by, say, Greta Thunberg. Her entire identity is wrapped up in this issue. She has claimed that it's entirely existential, that people should reduce their consumption of all sorts of different things, energy, types of food, and reorient their lives entirely around climate change because it's an imminent threat and is going to wipe out humanity in a few decades. And a lot of young progressives in the United States and throughout the West really believe that. Bill Gates and other people saying that they're rethinking the balance of the investment that should go to climate change isn't going to affect them. In fact, they're going to be widely condemned by the activist class. But then I do think that you'd see a lot of, say, Democratic politicians in the United States, a lot of investors, people like Larry Fink at BlackRock, who was the real face and leader of the ESG movement and has kind of backed away from his own bold predictions about where that was going. And like you said, someone like Mikey Sherrill, the Democratic nominee for a governor in New Jersey, she's succeeding a governor in New Jersey who was all in on climate, who poured billions of state resources into trying to develop offshore wind, whereas Mikey Sherrill, seeing the way that the political winds are blowing, doesn't say anything like that. She isn't against green energy, but she isn't saying we're going to double down on it the way that her predecessors did in the past. And so I think that at the elite level, you do see certain progressives starting to moderate a little bit on the climate issue, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to still have a really big, vocal class of activists who remain all in on it.
Let's turn to Texas, where Attorney General Ken Paxton has now filed a lawsuit against the makers of the pain reliever Tylenol, piggybacking off some claims recently from Health and Human Services Secretary RFK Jr. that there is some alleged link between Tylenol use by pregnant women and later autism in their children. Let's listen to Ken Paxton on Newsmax on Tuesday explaining this lawsuit.
For basically moving this out, knowing that they had liability, knowing that they had misled doctors, that they'd misled the public. They could have easily stopped this from happening by letting people know when they knew. And that's part of what this lawsuit is going to discover. When did they know it? What did they know? And why didn't they act to prevent damage to children and major damage? Think if your child has autism because of this, potentially, that is significant damage to our population and to our children. And so they should be held responsible. That's exactly what a Texas Attorney General should do, or any Attorney General, is protect their consumers from fraudulent activity and from things that will do harm to their families.
Alicia, start with the facts. What is the reality about this alleged link between Tylenol and autism that RFK Jr. has cited and is now being used in this lawsuit by Ken Paxton?
Right. So the evidence that RFK Jr., the Health and Human Services Secretary, cited in a press conference about a month ago with the president and FDA commissioner largely echoes the quote unquote evidence that was presented by some trial attorneys in a lawsuit against Kenvue, which was a spinoff from Johnson & Johnson. Now, a federal judge widely criticized or broadly criticized the studies that they presented because they didn't actually prove a causative link. Now, what that means is that there may be an association, but the studies, there were only about actually 6 that actually even looked at the link between autism and Tylenol. The others actually that are presented in these lawsuits looked at other neurodevelopmental disorders and Tylenol. But those 6 studies find a very weak link, and there are studies that have shown when you control for the genetics of the mother, when you look at, for instance, sibling pairs, siblings of the same mother, so you kind of in that way are able to control for certain genes, as well as the maternal health. you don't find any kind of association, let alone one that suggests causation. And there are actually several factors, what's called a Bradford analysis, that scientists use to determine whether there could be a causative or association. And that one is a dose response. So a woman who used more Tylenol during pregnancy would actually have a higher risk. A strong association across multiple studies, and kind of a biologically plausible mechanism. And what the judge said in the 2023 ruling, Denise Coates, was that, well, the vast majority of these factors don't point to any causative link. The plaintiff attorneys cherry picked the studies that they liked, ignored the evidence that they didn't like, or the undermined their arguments, and she dismissed the lawsuits. Now they are appealing that case to this the Second Circuit, and there's actually the trial on that, interestingly enough, is supposed to start next month. So this is also curious timing. There was also a similar lawsuits brought in California State Court that were earlier dismissed this year. Again, because the evidence is very weak. The FDA over the last decade has repeatedly looked at the studies that have purported to find a link and has determined that it's not strong enough to require a change in the safety label on Tylenol to warn women. The safety label, by the way, does direct pregnant women to discuss with their doctors before using, but it does not say that it is actually causes or increases the risk of autism or ADHD. One of the reasons why the FDA is somewhat cautious about this is because there's no real other painkiller, fever reducer on the market that pregnant women can take. Anti-inflammatories like aspirin or ibuprofen actually can harm the fetus and they've actually fever in itself has been linked to increased risk of autism and ADHD. So not taking anything when you have a high fever can actually do harm too. The Texas AG Ken Paxton basically elides all this in his lawsuit. And one other point I'd note is that the lawsuit is very similar to some of these lawsuits you see Democratic states bringing against the oil companies, saying that, well, there was evidence that that their emissions was causing climate change, and they hid it, and they didn't warn the public, and therefore they are liable for, hundreds of billions of dollars. I mean, they haven't put Ken Paxton and his trial lawyer friends here, Ashley Keller's the lead litigator, haven't determined how much they are seeking in damages, but that's fundamentally what this is. It's about helping Ken Paxton's trial lawyer friends, and to some extent, in my view, rallying the MAGA base for Ken Paxton's primary challenge against John Cornyn.
So the bottom line is that the medical authorities had looked at this evidence and didn't think that it was strong enough, for example, to require change on the label for Tylenol. And now Ken Paxton is in court upset at Tylenol that they didn't change the label anyway. Alicia mentions the Senate Republican primary in Texas that Ken Paxton is running in. And notably, Monet, it's a pretty tight race down there. So the University of Houston had a poll earlier this month. Ken Paxton, John Cornyn effectively tied, 34% backing Paxton, 33% backing the incumbent Senator Cornyn, 22% for Republican Congressman Wesley Hunt, who has also recently thrown his hat into the ring in this Republican primary. And so, not to sound cynical, but if you're Senator Cornyn and trying to box out Ken Paxton and try to make sure you get that Republican primary nomination for reelection. You can go on TV, you can go on C-SPAN. You don't have no tools at hand, for sure. You can go out and meet constituents and whatnot. But if you're the sitting Attorney General of Texas, one thing you could do is file a lawsuit against somebody. That's a great way of getting headlines. We're talking about it right now. And Ken Paxton, you just saw, was on Newsmax talking about how he is helping to make America healthy again.
Yeah, and it'll be a fascinating political experiment because I'm not so sure that attacking Tylenol is going to be a big political winner for Ken Paxton. It's an extremely popular drug. A lot of people depend on it for daily headaches, pregnant women in particular. It's one of the only drugs that's recommended as safe for a lot of uses for them if they're experiencing a fever or something like that. I think that Ken Paxton is assuming that there's a lot of energy behind the MAHA movement, and that's true. I do think that there are a lot of conservatives, especially, who think what RFK Jr. is doing in Washington is broadly popular and want to take on some of these companies. But I think that there's a big split between the action against, say, people making processed food and the impurities in some of these foods that might make people so unhealthy versus attacking the vaccine makers and the drug makers who are providing, in some cases, life-saving treatments. And there's pretty weak evidence in those cases, as opposed to the food where there's strong evidence of a lot of the harms being alleged. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Tylenol lawsuit ends up either being flat or maybe even provokes a backlash against Paxton, depending on how it unfolds.
Alicia, what's your read of that, of the politics of this? Is there a Republican primary voter base for Make America Healthy Again going after Tylenol like this? And to Monee's point about how the lawsuit ends, I mean, maybe that is part of the question too, is whether this gets bounced out of court pretty quickly, or whether the wheels of the court system turn slowly enough that this lawsuit is still ongoing at the time that Texas Republicans go to vote in this primary.
So, on the first question, is there a base or a voter base who would support this? Now, I think to Monee's point that there is a strong MAHA crowd, and that has this, vague sense that the kids are less healthy than they used to be. They're experiencing more chronic diseases, the asthma, the allergies, ADHD, autism, and there are actually a lot of different reasons for that. There's not one single reason. And I think there's also a sense that what we are eating, ingesting, isn't good for us for the most part, and people don't exercise enough. And I think that's the part of RFK's message that really resonates with most people. Now, the targeting the Tylenol is bizarre. This isn't really a MAHA issue, except that RFK, his friends again, and the trial lawyers have targeted this. And he and Ken Paxton have made some statements. Oh, this is just another example of Johnson & Johnson, who is the original manufacturer, is trying to hide the ball and trying to, just as it did with the allegedly the talc powder and the COVID vaccines. I mean, there was actually a book written by one of these RFK Jr. acolytes just on how attacking the company Johnson & Johnson, and that this is just another big pharma deception, and they're really trying to make people sick while taking all your money. It's just a really anti-business and anti-corporate message. Now, I don't think that really resonates with the broader Texas Republican base or the broader base, nation, or broader Republican base nationwide. How this, as for your second question, how does this end in court, or what will ultimately happen? I think Johnson & Johnson, or at least I'm told, they're going to seek to get this dismissed on summary judgment. Actually, as they were in California, they're going to argue that they don't have a duty, quote unquote, duty to warn. And that means because they already put something on the package saying that pregnant women should discuss with their doctors and physicians before taking the message, that essentially absolve them of any requirement. And then second, the science really is bad. And the FDA hasn't required this label change. because the evidence is unclear, and so therefore they should not be required to warn or disclose to consumers something that is really based on pretty iffy and murky evidence. I think the case does continue through the next year's elections. These kinds of torts can take several years. You can see it, especially if they become quote unquote mass torts. The litigation, as said, probably is one intended to extract more money from the companies. That's what all these lawsuits are. And two, I think Ken Paxton really is trying to tie himself to RFK Jr. because RFK Jr. does have a base of support in the Republican Party. And he's trying to galvanize this kind of populist Republican, anti-corporate, anti-business crowd to propel him in that primary challenge against John Cornyn.
Thank you, Alicia and Monet. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.